Hello, today I'm going to be giving you my time travel book recommendations. Although I'm a huge fantasy fan, none of these books will be fantasy books. I haven't read any fantasy books that explore time travel. I think there's an Anne McCaffrey book that does that. I'm not sure if I could see those two things going together very well, but I think that there is a nice variety on this list. And as far as why I love time travel, that is quite mysterious to me, except for the fact that maybe I loved Back to the Future as a kid. That movie was on loop in my household growing up. I also love the Netflix show Dark, which explores time travel in such a fascinating, unique way. So I think there might be different reasons for why I love it. And I think, like I said, I think we can go into some different reasons for each of these books. The first book I have to mention here is probably the most hard sci-fi book of all the books I'm going to mention today, and that's Timeline by Michael Crichton. Now, this was published in 1999. I read it a couple of years ago, and this book follows a group of history students who go back in time to 14th century France to save their history teacher, and it deals with quantum mechanics to explain the time travel in a very thorough way. And it's interesting the way it's handled in this book. Now, when I read it at the time, I did find that the middle section of the book maybe was a little bit more slow paced than I was hoping. And I felt like it accelerated quite a bit towards the end. But I loved the themes explored towards the end of the book. And I really enjoyed the way that Michael Crichton, one, used quantum mechanics to explain the time travel in this book, but two, the way that he depicted 14th century France. I thought it was so creative the way he did it. I really enjoyed it. And so it was a big surprise to me to the point where long after reading it, I kept thinking about the book and now kind of want to reread it. Now, I will say it's not the most developed concerning characters. If that's something that's important to you, then this might not be the book for you. But like I said, I think the themes explored are fascinating. I think that the science element is really well told, at least as far as I can tell. And also, the prologue to this book is one of the best prologues I've ever read in a book. I'll just read the first paragraph, but the whole entire prologue is really good. Science at the end of the century. 100 years ago, as the 19th century drew to a close, scientists around the world were satisfied that they had arrived at an accurate picture of the physical world. As physicist Alistair Ray put it, by the end of the 19th century, it seemed that the basic fundamental principles governing the behavior of the physical universe were known. Indeed, many scientists said that the study of physics was nearly completed. No big discoveries remained to be made, only details and finishing touches. And this was also taken from Alistair Ray's Quantum Physics, Illusion or Reality. I love that introduction, and it was oddly familiar to me when I read it. I wonder if I had read it before or heard of it before, but this idea of the scientific community as a whole coming to some agreements on how much there is to know of the universe and whether they know everything there is to know or how close they are to knowing everything, going into new periods of time where they realize they know so little. And I just think it's so fascinating the way that happens in history. Again, I think it explores some interesting themes, and I think that Michael Crichton, he's just amazing at the way he weaves together the historical fiction aspects with the sci-fi and time travel and quantum mechanics aspects. From what I understand, there's a film adaptation that was made in 2003. I never saw it, and I don't know what the reception was for that film, but obviously Michael Crichton was a very powerful voice when it comes to sci-fi. That's the only Crichton book I've ever read. I don't know if I'll read Jurassic Park, but I would like to read some other Crichton sometime. Next book on my list is Kindred by Octavia Butler, which was published in the 70s and still talked about today for good reason. So this book follows Dana, an African-American writer who is married to a white man, and she mysteriously gets thrown into the past, into a pre-Civil War Maryland plantation, and she meets a couple of her ancestors, including a white man. And as a Black woman, she deals with the hardships of racism at that time. And so the book is interesting in that the time travel aspect is kept very mysterious. You don't really understand why Dana is thrown into the past when she is thrown into the past. And although she really struggles with this, and she struggles with the racism at the time. I think that Dana is such a survivor in the story. Now, this is a story that I would say is it's kind of a quiet story in a way. It's told in first person. Again, you don't get the hard science that you get with like the Crichton book. It's not quite like that, but I think that this book, the time travel, is used more to highlight the themes, especially as far as us thinking that we've evolved from the past as far as racism is concerned, and how maybe we have way more work to do, and how these things still come up to haunt us even in the present. So this book was very, very poignant, I think. And as soon as I finished it, I knew I wanted to reread it. So I highly recommend this book for everyone. It's a short book, and it's one, again, that I would like to reread someday. Next on my list is 11/22/63 by Stephen King. So this was published in 2011, and I read this a couple of years ago. Actually, I read this in 2020, and I was so impressed with this book. This was the second Stephen King book I had read at the time, and it was highly recommended to me from my oldest brother. This is his favorite book of all time, and he's a huge Stephen King fan. Actually, both my parents have read this book, and both my brothers have read this book. So it's kind of like a family favorite, I guess, for a lot of my family members, or at least it's my oldest brother's favorite, I'll say that. And this book follows a man named Jake Epping, who is a high school teacher, a divorced high school teacher, and he time travels back to 1958 and through this portal at the back of a cafe. And so this time travel portal, it takes you back to the year 1958. And from there, you could stay in the past as long as it takes you forward from 1958 on. But if you go back through this portal, it will be as though only 2 minutes have passed in the future present. So he decides to do this in order to stick around long enough to prevent the assassination of JFK, thus preventing the atrocities thereafter, including Vietnam. It is fascinating the way that King shows you the past without romanticizing it, even the parts of the past that we do romanticize, or we tend to romanticize the 50s at least. But I think that he shows a very realistic, gritty portrayal of the past. And at the same time, I just thought the plot of this book was very suspenseful, very gripping. And I know a lot of people aren't a big fan of the romance that happens in this book, but honestly, I think that everything that happened in the book, in my opinion, I appreciated. I felt like it had a purpose. I thought it added to the story, but that's just my own personal take. I know there is an adaptation on this I haven't seen, so I can't speak to that, but I loved this book. And what I also really loved about this book, in addition to the way that King was able to present the past, was also the way that he sort of brings forward this idea of the past almost having a consciousness of itself and maybe being resistant to changing. And that was such an interesting theme that's kind of brought to life in this book. So highly recommend if you want a really interesting, gripping, suspenseful sort of time travel book that has a really interesting message too, I think, about historical events. Next book I have to mention is one I've mentioned quite a few times on my channel this last year because I read it last summer, and that's Before the Coffee Gets Cold by Kawaguchi. Now, this is a translated Japanese work, and one of the criticisms I've honestly heard for this book is that the writing style is a little clunky, and I don't know how much of that has to do with it being a translated work or not. But what I really enjoyed about this book is it was rather short. It felt like a good palate cleanser. I thought it was very touching at times. So this deals with 4 storylines. It's almost like 4 short stories, but they're all kind of woven together in a little way through this Tokyo cafe. And in this Tokyo cafe, there is a ghost woman who is seated at a table, and once a day she gets up to use the bathroom. And if you take her seat while she is in the bathroom, then you can time travel. As long as you are poured a cup of coffee, you could time travel to any time in the past or future, as long as you remain in the seat of that cafe, so you can't go anywhere else. And you have to drink your coffee before it gets cold. So there are certain rules regarding the time travel in this book, and it's very touching what these people learn about themselves through this experience. It's also kind of an experience in futility, because another rule is that you can't change the past or future, but it's still an interesting exploration. It moved me to tears at times, And I really enjoyed it. I loved the quirkiness of this Tokyo cafe too in this setting. So if that sounds like it might appeal to you, I definitely recommend it as a good palate cleanser. Next on my list is a book that probably nobody has heard about, and I don't know if you ever will again after this video, but it's one that's called Summer of Love by Lisa Mason. And so this book is very old, as we've discovered in previous videos. I'm kind of old. And this particular book is dealing with a young girl named Susan. And Susan, alias Starbright, she runs away from home. You find out later in the book why that's the case, but she runs away from home to join the hippies in the Summer of Love in 1967 in San Francisco. And so it's very much an incredible historical fiction. I loved the way that Lisa Mason brought to life the 60s and the Haight Ashbury area of San Francisco. The characters were very colorful and vivid. It was very imaginative. You could almost hear the music on the streets. It felt that well depicted. And one thing that you also learn as you read on in this story is that there is a man who comes from the very, very, very distant future. And he comes back to make sure that Susan, young Susan, who is only 14 years old, that to make sure that she is going to be okay. One thing I loved about this book, in addition to the way that Lisa Mason brought to life the 60s at this time, was the way in which she also not only showed the colorful, exciting parts of the 60s, but also showed the darker tones of that time too. She really brought forth just the heavy, dark, gritty parts of that time. And you see it through Susan's eyes, this young 14-year-old kid. And I really appreciated that. Another thing I really loved about this book is it's very much like a chosen one type of story in a way, because the idea is to make sure that Susan will be okay. But at the same time, she's not on this big heroic quest or an obvious one either. It's more about what her life will bring long after she is gone. And there was something about that message that I found personally meaningful. Now, I don't know how well this book is aged because I read it when I was a teenager and I read it years later, but it's been a long time. I'm really overdue for a reread again, but I know that I enjoyed it just as much later in life as I did when I was a teenager. But it's hard to say. It's hard to say if it will read well now, but it was one that was meaningful to me, and it was actually my first time travel book. So I felt like I should go ahead and mention it. And it also blends together that beautiful historical fiction aspect that I love, where we are looking at the past in a very well realized way, while at the same time looking at the darker tones through a modern lens. And then the last book that I have to mention here is actually a manga, and that is Orange, which I've also mentioned on my channel a few times last year. And that particular manga has to do with these high school students who receive letters from their future selves about a boy in their class who is contemplating taking his life and how they can prevent that. And so we deal with mental health in this manga. And I know it's very controversial. A lot of people thought it was controversial a few years ago when it was talked about a lot on BookTube, because the idea of people in your life, whether they are friends or close loved ones, being able to prevent you from taking your own life can be kind of a controversial idea. There is some question as to how much friendship plays a role in somebody making that decision. And while I'm not one to speak about that, I do think that it is important that we have conversations about this topic, because sometimes there are signs in which somebody might say certain things or make it known that they're struggling. And sometimes those things can be a little disregarded if we're not paying attention. So I think it's good for us to pay attention to those things and have these conversations, even if it's maybe not within our control what somebody chooses to do. And so I really appreciated that. I really appreciated the theme of friendship. I thought it was quite endearing in this manga. And I really enjoyed my time with it. It does deal a lot with survivor's guilt. So there could be a trigger warning there if somebody has had someone who has died by suicide. So that concludes all of my time travel recommendations for now. I would love to hear from you. If you have any recommendations for me, please let me know in the comment section below. Again, I just think this is such an interesting kind of theme, time, because it's the one thing we can't control. We can't go back to the past, we can't go to the future, but it's amazing how we can explore that through literature and the way it can sort of highlight different themes that reflect back to us things we're dealing with now. So I really appreciate that about time travel stories. I think they also just make me appreciate what right now has to offer, ironically, too. So I'd love to hear from you. Do you have any recommendations for me? Have you read any of these books? Do you plan to read any of these books? Thank you so much for watching and have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.